Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's AWRI webinar. My name is Robin Dixon and I'm a Senior Viticulturist with the AWRI. Apologies for the slightly late start today. Chris's laptop, as he says, has had its own personal hailstorm today, so I think we're back on track now. In the spirit of reconciliation, the AWRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. I would also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing funding and support for webinars via the AWRI Extension project. So in this session, we'll look at recovering from hail damage, so pruning and other steps to vine recovery. So this webinar is a follow-on from the one that we did back in November, bouncing back from hail. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to go back and listen to it. So in that webinar, we discussed the effects of the hail events that were experienced in the Riverland and Barossa Valley last year, and also the Franklin River in 2014. And we discussed options for supporting vines straight after the hail event. So all past webinars can be found on the AWRI webinar page under Services to Industry. So in the webinar today, we will be talking about what you can do over pruning leading into next season. So before we make a start, a couple of quick reminders. If you would like to provide a comment or ask a question, please click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type in your question and click send to send it through. We'll be holding the Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but feel free to send your questions through at any stage. A reminder also that the session is being recorded and you'll be emailed a link to view the recording on the AWRI's YouTube channel. So for anyone who has just joined us, welcome. Today's webinar topic is recovering from hail damage, pruning and other steps to vine recovery. It's a great pleasure to welcome Chris Rogers from Rogers Viticulture and Mandy Mader from Call the Vine Scout. Chris has over 30 years of experience in viticulture across technical management and grower liaison roles. He is a Charles Sturt University graduate and has formal training in winery operations, health and safety, quality control and team leadership. Chris also works closely with the Barossa and Clare Valley Grape and Wine Associations and growers across other wine regions in South Australia. Amanda has 28 years of technical and operational viticulture experience across South Australia with large corporate wine companies and her own vineyard and wine company, as well as operating her own Vine Scout, the vineyard monitoring and viticulture technical support service. So Chris and Mandy, if you're ready, I'd like to hand it over to you.
And you ready?
No.
Don't need that. Okay. Hopefully you can hear us okay.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
No worries. Thanks, Robin. So yeah, cycle the slides for us, please. So yeah, apologies guys for the little hiccup my end. As I said, my laptop needs a bit of a prune itself. So just a quick outline on the today. So I'll just give a really quick high-level summary on the events that have happened across Australia. Briefly talk about the impacts of hail damage. I think everybody's pretty familiar with that. I think Mandy's provided some really fascinating data on the bud dissection work and then myself and Ian can talk about sort of the more practical scenarios and quite a few photos. So I think people might realise this webinar follows on from one we did back in November last year. So I won't be going back over all that history. We're really here to talk about where to from here going forward. So, and I guess I think we'll do another webinar perhaps in August to look back some of those experiences, those remedial actions after hailstorms. So it could be interesting. So if you want to go to the next slide, Ronald. So this is just a quick summary of the events that occurred across the Australian wine region in the last growing season. They're not necessarily accurate details in all cases. I guess I didn't get a lot of detail about the Griffith events. For those people in those respective regions, you would obviously remember well what happened. I think that, the telling part of this is it was a pretty unprecedented growing season with a hell of a lot of storms across many regions. I guess it's probably even some small storms that probably didn't even appear in the sort of main reports. And can talk a bit more about the Riverland event. I think the major one on the 6th of November was very impactful. The Barossa events are the ones obviously that Mandy and I are most familiar with. The 28th of October was a huge amount of damage. So a lot of what you'll see today in our preso will be photos and examples related to that. So it will be reasonably Barossa-centric with what we cover, but hopefully there's some useful information for everyone there. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. So I guess it's just really quickly recapping the impacts of hail, the more immediate effects. Dr. Paul Petrie covered this really well in the webinar in November. So I'd probably encourage people to go back and look at that on YouTube if they'd like a bit more detail. So just flick through, Rob, on the next 2 points. So basically, I guess, if you wanted to cycle the slide, that's it. So it's obviously, normal physical damage to shoots, leaves, bunches. I guess what we'll talk about today would be more so about, the impacts on cordon, canes, and so forth. I guess I won't talk too much about the other issues with regards to fungal disease. It stands to reason that at the time there was obviously some impacts. Generally, what we found in the drier climates like Barossa, we didn't really see much issue with botrytis thereafter, noting that in the Barossa's case, that was a pretty early hailstorm, shoots sort of 50 centimetre stage. And with our dry summers, that really turned into a problem. Powdery mildew became a problem in a few vineyards where perhaps control after the hail wasn't as good as it could have been through congested canopies. Trunk diseases, I think, is sometimes talked about, but at least from what I saw, I didn't see too many scenarios where I would regard those wounds as being overly problematic to introducing trunk disease. And I guess the wound healing in the growing seed is very different than it is with a pruning cut. So, with the next slide. So these points, if you want to run out, there's all 4 points. So thanks, Robin. Really, it's what I'd sort of call the subsequent effects, which is more what we'll talk about today in terms of how it affected subsequent growth, which is obviously dealing with the canes that we're working with now. Energy carbohydrate levels, that's an area which we very varied in impact, depending on timing, which we'll talk about. And certainly what Mandy will talk more about is the impacts on bud fruitfulness and how that can flow onto yield and obviously wine quality. The other little point I make too is being involved in the propagation sector. Unfortunately, this has caused a lot of damage to some key source blocks. So we're going to, in these scenarios when they occur, can have flow-on effects where people may want a particular variety or clone and it simply won't be available. The canes are just too badly affected in those key source blocks. So next slide, please. So I guess at this point I'll hand to Mandy. She can talk about her work with the bud dissections.
Okay, this is just a quick diagram to outline the physiology of the bud and the transport system, which I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with. We have the primary bud, We have the secondary buds, the flower cluster primordias, and we also have the tendril primordia. Yeah, next page, please, Robin. So what we're actually looking at with bud fruitfulness assessment is we have a picture of a compound bud taken under the microscope where we have the primary bud. In the centre there, we have the secondary bud to the left, secondary bud 1, and then what is also known as the tertiary bud on the bottom right-hand side is also referred to as a secondary bud number 2. So when we see death of the primary bud, as we'll see in the next slide, Robin, so you're going to switch over, next slide. Awesome job. You can see we have death of the primary bud. In this particular case, it can be due to hail damage or primary bud necrosis, or sometimes we see the primary bud being, death due to, massive bud mite infestation from the bud mite larvae. So what we do when we see death of the primary bud is we'll head into the secondary bud number 2, and in majority of the varieties, we will usually see 1 bunch per shoot. This isn't the case with all varieties, but just a quick touch on primary bud necrosis. Most common causes, as I'd say most of us are quite familiar with, due to high shoot vigor, excessive irrigation, excessive shading, reduced bud carbohydrates, and in some cases, high levels of gibberellaric acid in high vigor shoots as cited by literature. So as we move on to the next page, Robin, we can see we've got varying degrees of hail damage to the primary bud. So on the left top side, we can see death of the primary bud. And then as we look at the top right-hand side, we see partial death of the primary bud. And as we look down to the bottom right, we have a question mark here where we can see the primary bud is turning dark green. So we don't know whether this bud will survive or whether it will die back. But then there's another option here. We can see in that photograph, there's an alive secondary bud as well. But what we're always hoping for on the bottom right is a healthy, fruitful primary bud, which we can see, and an alive secondary. And in this particular photo, the hail damage had occurred on the underneath side of that shoot. So let's head to the next page. We'll discuss bud dissection data and observations out in the field in the Barossa Valley. So the photo on the bottom left-hand side is a pre-prune treatment straight after the hailstorm of October 28. The grower has opted to tear out the hail damaged shoots. And as we can see in this left-hand side photo, we've got new growth, which is looking quite strong. On the right-hand side, the picture on the right-hand side, the grower has, created a control and has opted to leave and do nothing. And you can see that the growth here has damaged between bud 1 and 2. This is also an interesting observation. If we look at the data table right up the top there, we have the pre-pruned average number of primordia per bud is certainly higher in comparison to the control, a value of 1.75, which is quite high, versus 1.58. Also to note, the death of the primary bud in the pre-prune section is 0 compared to 30% in the control. So this is, quite an interesting scenario. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you, Robin. And we have another scenario here of a vineyard in Eden Valley where, it looked like the Russian army had come through with a cutter bar straight afterwards. The grower had no choice but to cut all his varieties back to 1 bud spur due to the sheer severity. Look, this guy would have only had, 3 buds per shoot to play with. So with all his varieties, Cabernet, Riesling, Shiraz and Sagrantino, everything had to be cut back to 1 bud spurs. So pretty much we did a dissection a week ago and we can see that the average primordia range is ranging between 1.59 in the Sagrantino through to 1.7 in the Riesling, which is a fantastic result, given that, he had to take the hardcore option here. And when we look at the data table just below that, with regards to death of the primary bud, the percentage of primary bud necrosis is only ranging between 2 and 13%, which is very, very low. So as we move on to the next slide, thanks, Robin. We also have a grower on the Barossa that sustained hail damage to both of his spur prune vineyard and also to his arch cane prune vineyard. So on the left-hand side is his spur vine, and on the, that's on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we might be able to make out a bit of an arch cane. Yeah, the foliage is looking a little bit more denser here because of the new lateral growth. So what we can see in this particular case, the average primordia per bud is higher in the arch cane section, 1.56 versus 1.46 in the spur. But what we have here, we have a catch-22 situation. If you spur prune, your yield potential will drop, because we can see that in bud 1 and 2, the inflorescence primordia averages, sort of around the 1.45 and 1.47, which is, sort of just below moderate. But then if you 2-bud spur off the arch cane, parts of that cane had been damaged by hail. And in this particular case, there's also hail damage on the spur itself, which we can see closer in the next slide, Robin. I'll show you. Do you want to switch over to the next? Yeah, thanks, Robin. So the picture on the left-hand side is the arch cane section. And you can see that spur. If you're going to spur that back to 2 buds, between bud 1 and 2, you've got massive hail damage in that particular photo. So I guess take-home message here, if you've got options to take, canes that are less hail damaged, I think that would be a more viable option, that's for sure. But yeah, there's a lot of thinking involved on what to do here. So if we move on to the next slide. This is an example of some extreme hail damage encountered in the Canberra district on January the 3rd of this year. And this looks quite severe, where we've had hail damage on unlignified shoots. A grower sent me cane samples of 10 buds long to analyse, and as you can see in the data table above, the average number of primordia across all 10 buds had an average value of 0.96, being quite low. As viewed in the picture below, you can see there's a picture of a primary bud, and we can view the secondary under the microscope. The primary bud is dead, but the little secondary bud on the right-hand side is almost on its way out. I don't think that's going to survive. So across all 10 buds, the average percent where the primary bud had died was 61%, as highlighted in the data table above, which is a pretty high incidence of primary bud death. As we move on to the next page, Robin. So we have a pruning scenario where we have a pencil thickness cane that had been hail damaged, and that we can see in the data table just below. We have PBN, which is talking about the death of the primary bud. We only had bud 3, which had a Y for yes, where we had death of the primary bud. And as you can see, we've got a lot of 2s up there with regards to the number of inflorescence primordia per bud, which is still, so on bud 1 and 2, right, and then we had 7, 8 and 10. We had a few 2s in there, but also we had a few deaths in there as well. So I guess the options here, you got the option of maybe 2 buds spurring, because we have inflorescence primordia in bud 1 and bud 2 being 2 each, which is still quite viable. We could select the minimally damaged canes, but then if you did want to take this particular cane, there's a risk that this cane will snap while twisting and wrapping down. So a bit of thought certainly needs to go into this pruning scenario. So let's head to the next page. So this is an interesting one. We have a shoot that's been hail damaged, and as a result, you can see that 2 laterals have formed from this. So I guess next decision is, what do we do here? So as we move to the next slide, Robin, we've got, well done, thank you. We have the bottom section, we can see the part of the cane is quite damaged by hail, and we can see a beautiful new lateral growth that's come off of bud 2. So the hail damaged section of the cane is certainly much less fruitful, with the number of inflorescences You know, we've got 1 in bud 1, we've got 0 in bud 2, we got 2 in bud 3, 0 in bud 4, and 1 in 5. Yet you look up the top table where you've got the bud fruitfulness of the lateral, certainly looking more stronger. You can see a picture of a beautiful live primary bud and a secondary, and the incidence of this scenario is certainly high in the new lateral. So the options here is to take off that dead section of the hail damaged cane, and you've got the option to take this new fruitful lateral. So moving forward, we have another vine that was severely hit by hail. This occurred in the Canberra region, and you can see a shoot in the right-hand side where it still hadn't been lignified, that had been severely hit by hail. Not a pretty sight. So if we move forward, so unfortunately, sadly, that cane that you saw in the photo, there was a lot of canes that, yeah, I don't know, that one looks quite deceased actually. The end result here is the entire cane is almost dead, where all buds from 1 to 10 had the primary bud dead, with only 3 buds alive in the secondary, which we can see in bud 1, 2, and 5 in the data set above. And each primary bud across those 10 buds had a YFS indicating that all primary buds were dead. So in this particular case, the only option you can do is rework by taking up water shoots. And if there's no water shoots present, I guess what you need to do is maybe, you know, cut the top or even kneecap the vine to force new growth with added nutrition. So this is, yeah, quite a difficult scenario. Okay, so the next page. A lot of questions have been asked, given that we've just come out of the La Nina season. Have we got primary bud necrosis due to La Nina, or is it hail damage? So we've got this data section in blue where we're looking at bud 1 and bud 2, and we can see the data highlighted in red is representing where the hail damage had affected bud fruitfulness, where either the primary bud is dead and or the entire compound bud is dead. We can see on the bottom left-hand side, when we look at cane number 8, 9, and 10, we can see that the primary bud's dead here with an alive secondary. This is, I'd say, due to the La Nina influence, due to either excessive vigour and the shading out of bud 1 and bud 2, which was probably experienced more so in the eastern states, even although we are seeing this in the regions of SA as well. I guess a lot of thought needs to be put into pruning decisions here, because you've got you have 2 factors here that are causing primary bud necrosis. I'd also like to thank Liz Riley and Jen Fisher for sending us 3 pictures of the aftermath damage in the Canberra region and the cane samples for bud fruitfulness assessment. So in conclusion, on the next page, thanks Robin. Well, what can we say? There's no right or wrong answer here, as each scenario is different. Try to use the canes and the spurs that are least affected by hail. And hey, if unsure, seek a bud fruitfulness assessment. This might assist you with selecting, you know, the most optimal pruning strategy to maximise your yield potential for 2023. Thanks for your attention. Put you back on to Chris.
Thanks, Mandy. That's fascinating information. So hopefully, as we go through the rest of this, I'll probably join the dots a few more things. So I'll just go through, I guess, some of my thoughts. And again, these will be fairly Barossa-centric, but hopefully some other things useful to other regions. But certainly, yeah, getting out there and really carefully assess the damage you've got. I guess sometimes I've found, talking with growers recently, that until you really get out there and actually start pruning 5, 10 vines, it is quite hard to really get a handle on it. So I'd certainly encourage people who haven't done that already, get out there, prune some vines, look at all your options, and especially obviously do that before you start bringing in your pruning team. having really clear instructions is going to be challenging this year. So just want to pop out the next 3 points on the slide, Ron. So I'll talk to them. So yeah, I think it's obvious you need to be really clear about what you want to achieve for your vineyard. Resources, labour, financial and so forth is certainly going to be a big factor in your decision making as well. Certainly probably very challenging in some cases. And really knowing what your plans for your vineyard are. There are scenarios I know where people might decide this is going to trigger them reworking their vineyard sooner than they might have done so. They may have a variety or an area they're actually thinking about replanting. And also, I guess it's a case of, how quickly do you want to remediate the damage that you're dealing with? So I guess, having a really clear plan is really important. And certainly in the more complex vineyards where you've got multiple blocks and varieties, premium regions, I think having a clear plan on every block would be really important, because we're certainly seeing quite different scenarios, whether it be variety, row orientation, even aspect, and obviously things like vigour and so forth will have a big bearing on how each one's treated. So it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all situation. So you want to move on to the next slide, please. So these basically, just what I've done is just put forward some thoughts here regarding cane pruning, and this is in scenarios where people would normally cane prune regardless. So I think, as Mandy's highlighting, you'll see in some photos, I'll whip over these points and hopefully the photos will make a bit more sense on what my point is with each of these. Is certainly cane integrity, or its capacity to carry shoot growth and crop through the next season, is going to be critical. Fruitfulness, as Mandy I think made quite clear, they're quite often good lateral canes that are very good options. Subject, of course, to whether you had that regrowth. I'm well aware some regions had later season hail damage. Unfortunately, didn't see the kind of regrowth we've seen in Barossa, where the damage was much earlier. So that's going to certainly create some challenges. The two-part cane, I think Mandy showed an example of that. I'll elaborate that a bit more in a photo to come. The concept around arched cane is, we know in some cases where people want to lay a cane down, just physically getting it onto the trellis wire is going to create some issues. There may be scenarios if people have got two wires, they may actually just be able to very carefully arch that cane. It's not for everyone, but it certainly might give you a chance of that cane surviving. We certainly know with unsupported trellis systems, in terms of no foliage wires, that rotational that can be rolled will certainly snap canes later in the season once you get fruit and shoot load. So that might be one way of mitigating that. Hence my point about the foliage wire support. Are you in a windy region? I guess, as Mandy alluded to, that's one scenario. If you do decide that you can't cane prune and you just want to spur off what is there from last year's cane, you need to think, a bit carefully about, will there be sap flow, will there be bud survival, and will there even be strength in that so-called cordon to get you through. Young vines, top-worked, reworked vines, certainly seeing quite a lot of those being damaged. They're going to require, I think, very careful thought, especially regarding to getting them set up for the longer term. Hopefully for those who have the opportunity, you can find some suitable canes, but there'll be scenarios where people were hoping to establish a cordon that'll have to be put off for a year without doubt. The other thing I think we're certainly going to see is vine imbalance issues in some vineyards, and that might be where people just choose whatever they've got, and then that could be a very long internode cane. It could have low fruitfulness, as Mandy's alluded to. It could push a lot of growth from secondary and tertiaries, but then potentially have the growth but without the fruit load to keep the vines in balance. So if you want to jump forward, Robin, we'll just go through some photos. So I guess as an example, where we've obviously had a hell of a lot of good regrowth from the crown and everywhere. I guess the upside is lots of options here. As you can see, there's some really great canes. The existing cane, the wrap down, I certainly wouldn't want to be spurring that off. You'd have no reason to. The obvious challenge here is pruning is going to be pretty slow. So but at least there's an option. Next slide, next picture. So yeah, an example, obviously, you certainly would not want to be relying on spurring that off for obvious reasons. There is a cane there, hopefully, and then sort of in the background that you can make use of to re-establish something on the wire. So next photo. There's certainly scenarios like this too, which my view is if this is all you've got, I would run with it. It's obviously got some pitting. If you look down that bottom bud, fortunately there's not severe pitting just before it, so there should by rights be good sap flow, to my point earlier. I don't think this sort of damage is going to cause too many problems with that cane performing for the coming growing season. It's not ideal, but it's certainly better than nothing. And so I think, yeah, training your people to kind of select the best they can with consideration to how will that cane perform. The next photo. So yeah, another scenario where this is sort of another what I'd call a two-part cane. Obviously that broken section is gone, but that lateral that's fired up is quite usable in what is, you see by the trellis wires, another cane prune scenario. Certainly not an easy thing to wrap down. And obviously with the pruning, people are going to have lots of options before they move into that wrap down process. Arch cane may work in some cases to mitigate that, or it could simply be a very loose wrap and might be required in some cane pruning. So next photo, please. So this is some of Mandy's data where it's what I call a two-part cane in a cabinet block, a bit of damage on what I call the primary cane, and then obviously a lateral that's just been cut off for the photo. As you can see, the fruitfulness is not great down the bottom, but very good fruitfulness on the lateral part. That is obviously the most important part going forward. That it's interesting. There's an early photo where you get that lateral junction. That bud is very often, as Mandy's found, unfruitful, PBN or complete compound death in some cases, or otherwise just no bunches. That's a common pattern, but I wouldn't be too concerned in the concept of the length of a cane. It's still pretty good. Next photo. So I guess this is an example of the bigger scenario where a lower, bigger cane on Shiraz vine at the top. Sometimes you'll see those look a bit on the thin side, but the fruitfulness is very good. Whereas down the bottom, you're seeing a much higher, bigger cane, quite big, bullish cane, and then you certainly start seeing lower fruitfulness and high PBN. So you may not always have the choice, but if you can, I'd probably go for a slightly thinner cane than one that may seem big and strong, but potentially is less fruitful and might create more vine imbalance issues. Next photo. So yeah, it's just an example where obviously there's been some cane damage. So would that survive as a temporary cordon? Good question. I'd have some reservations. I think that rotational twisting force could cause a problem, but there may be scenarios where people don't have a whole lot of choice. Next photo. And these sort of scenarios, yeah, are the same thing. If you're going to spur that off, it's been complete bud destruction in one case there. Now, I think Mandy's point earlier is important too. When this sort of damage, the bud might appear okay, but it may actually be dead or die by the time we get bud burst. Obviously, I guess there may be scenarios where if you have to spur this off, then you're really going to be relying on that basal bud to. But again, it's more of a temporary scenario if that's if you can't find a suitable cane. Next slide. So just do you want to run those points. So this is just thoughts in more particularly to spur pruning. So where you've got a vineyard where you're going to spur prune regardless, obviously what you're going to select is going to be a pretty challenging one. The photo we'll get to will probably elaborate a bit more here. Thinking about things like cane maturity, internode length, and obviously the fruitfulness aspects that Mandy's talked about. One thing I am finding talking to people, there's occasionally people are making these assumptions that they're going to have low fruitfulness or poor spurs, etc., and then they load up with more spurs or load up with 3-4 bud spurs. I just express a lot of caution about that in some vineyards where you might be surprised sometimes that could actually end up being a lot more fruitful than we think, basically overcropping the vine and also potentially actually creating a lot of smaller weak growth, which just makes the job even harder in 2023. So don't be too presumptuous, would be my advice. And obviously think about what your goals of your vineyard are as well. So, and as I said earlier, pruning back basils may be required. There'll be some photos that elaborate on that. And then similarly, we don't want to start abandoning just good pruning practices as far as managing trunk diseases either. Some scenarios, we certainly saw this in vintage 22, but with lots of little small dead pieces of wood and stick. I guess depending on your situation, what you're targeting, we just don't want to, I guess, ignore that and end up with more mog again in 23. A little tip, I think, is probably pretty obvious. If you're sending in your pruning staff and you've got hail hit on one side, get them to prune that side if they can, because it'll make a big difference to making the best decisions and choices. We've certainly seen that in North South Rows in Barossa. If you're on that western side where the hail came from, you see a lot of damage. If you're on the other side, you could easily overlook it. And there's no question that, unfortunately, this in some vineyards could take 2 to 3 years to actually, get what I call the pruning structure back in order. So move on to the next slide, or next photos. So these are just some examples of some pretty severe damage. I think this, to my mind, this is an example with what Mandy's alluded to. Those buds, apart from just being physically destroyed in some cases, they could also actually just die, or obviously have high PBM in many cases. I guess that one on the left, someone might potentially create a longer spur to get them through. If that's the case, that's maybe fine, but need to make sure that we're also pushing growth from that basal part of the spur, so that hopefully then in 23 you're in a position to remediate the pruning structure. Dare I say, in this vineyard, until I look at the cordon, it may potentially be a candidate for reworking, which is obviously a big economic decision, but it might be the right thing for the long term. Next slide. So this is a bit of a mixed bag, this one. Lots of options. How you train your pruners about what to choose there. I think that more central one is probably the obvious one. Here we've got unlignified shoots, and we've also got powdery mildew. So I think you're going to have to be a bit more caution here, not only with how you prune, but this one is a scenario where I think powdery mildew potentially could have infected those early buds formation and be a flag shoot issue. So obviously going to have to be a bit more careful about carryover risk. Next picture. There's some complex ones. I suppose as a quick example where people might, I guess you can potentially do lots of different things here. That main shoot might be normal spur choice, but is there an option to also actually cut right back down, and that one on the far left, that becomes your future. Obviously then you're creating a bigger wound, and then I think getting in and doing your spraying, with your I guess the appropriate spray, within 7 days of pruning, maybe be more critical this year if people are going to start, I guess, remediating structures. So next picture. So this is a bit of a mess on the end here, but I suppose potentially if the spurs are really, there is no spur there, but I guess arguably that could be cut back if people want to run with that. Cut it right back to basils. There should by rights be good sap flow on that under part of the cane where there wasn't hail, to support the formation of better shoots and then potentially a better pruning structure next year. So, and that's the key, driving that basal shoot growth in some cases is going to be critical to that re-establishing that structure. So next slide. This is obviously a high vigor situation, which generally high vigor site, this particular one anyway, and a real mixed bag of hail damage, as you can see. but the vines obviously pushed a hell of a lot of shoot growth after the hail in Barossa. On one hand, you've got plenty of choices, but on the other hand, you've got very slow pruning, potentially some PBN in a few cases there. And I'll touch on it later, but I think this would be a potential candidate for shoot thinning. So next slide. So this is not how it's going to be pruned. This is just done for the sake of demonstrating. Also in some vineyards, high vigor, we had a lot of new shoot growth. We actually had a lot of late season growth and lack of lignification. So quite obviously that shoot there would not be any good as a spur. And it's probably just to highlight that if you're training up staff, just to remind them that not to rely on anything unlignified as a potential spur. So next slide. So you just pop out the points. So this is just some other points. Obviously, as I touched on earlier, I think I know shoot thinning is certainly not something for everyone. It's more of a premium region scenario, high-end wine quality, high-end price point. But certainly, I think there'll be some scenarios where we'll have, in Barossa especially, I think we've got vineyards with very good health and good regrowth. I don't think we're going to have a problem with carbohydrate reserves, and we could end up with some pretty congested, I guess, vine growth and canopies. That can be dealt with in winter 23, but could be the similar problems. Potentially shoot thinning might speed up that whole process of re-establishing good spur positions, good canes, more fruitful, I guess, buds for next year and beyond. So, we've done a lot of trials here in Barossa with shoot thinning, albeit not to do with hail damage. But one thing I think is often overlooked is just how much money you get back at pruning by shoot thinning. The trials we did here, that varied anywhere from 10 to 80% of that cost of shoot thinning was returned in faster pruning in the subsequent year. So again, not for everyone, but I think it could be a really powerful tool. And also obviously helps get the vines in better balance. The nutrient side of things, highly varied this one. I think in Barossa, we've seen such early damage, and we saw very good regrowth in many vineyards, very good, perfect growing season to encourage good regrowth, very good post-harvest leaf retention. So I think nutritionally we're in a good spot. I think in some scenarios I saw last year, some people probably poured on too much nitrogen. There's a bit of an overreaction and just created more vigor and PBN risk. But I'm very, very mindful in other regions around Australia, the damage is much, much later. So there's been some very severe leaf loss. Also, I guess when you get sort of fruit set and beyond, that you're in a situation you've got fruit that is a major sink for vine energy, then to lose that is obviously very depletive. That Canberra scenario I think is extremely depletive late in the season. Loss of leaf quite often, not a lot of regrowth, and obviously poor post-harvest reserves accumulation. The need to remediate that's going to be absolutely critical. So it is going to be highly varied, very hard to give generalist advice about that nutritional input. Some of the biostimulant products, foliars and so forth, certainly do help, and they seem to help a lot last year. Be mindful that, for your major macros, your NPK, calcium, magnesium, very difficult to get, significant amounts into the vine purely by foliar. So I guess having a good fertigation system in those scenarios is going to be critical. Keeping up irrigation in those dryland areas if you need to drive growth, certainly very important. But I'd probably, again, at Barossa, I don't see any reason why we're going to need to do anything dramatically different. My view is we're going to see some very good regrowth, especially to the winter outlook. So I don't see why we should be suddenly pumping on lots. Canopy management, obviously dealing with congestion, dealing with canopy support to reduce breakage would be really important. And I suppose really the closing points, I guess, is make basic decisions on what you see and adjust as you go along. Don't be too presumptuous and don't worry too much about what everybody else next door seeing. They may have a very different situation. So it's going to be a tough journey back for some vineyards to achieve that full recovery. But yeah, I guess with a lot of effort, I think it's quite possible. So I'll hand back to you, Rob. Oh, sorry, acknowledgements. Yep, at the end there. So it's obviously got a lot of support from Barossa Grapevine with work that Mandy and I've done, which has been great for, you know, talking with a lot of growers and viticulturists. And obviously, thanks to Robin and the other team to offer our thoughts for today.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Robin, but you're on mute.
Wow, that's wonderful, isn't it? I'm just jabbering along. Right. So Ian McRae, thank you for joining us. You are a very well-respected member of the Riverland grape growing region. You've had over 30 years of experience in vineyards, working as in grower liaison roles for both CCW and Accolade. You're now working as a consultant, helping growers in the Riverland. Thank you for joining us and providing us with some information about the hail experienced in the Riverland. So the two events there. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, well, we're getting used to hail events here in the Riverland, as I mentioned in the last conference we had. We've had severe hailstorms now in 2016, 2019, and again in 2021. We had 3 events this year. The most severe, as Chris mentioned, was on the 6th of November. But there was also a late one on the 11th of January, which caused different sorts of issues hitting so late. The main effects of that later one were wind damage, lots and lots of rows being rolled over with full crop loads on them at that stage. Fruit damage, the potential of rots became a problem then, but the most severe damage was on the 6th of November, where we estimated that about 500 hectares was severely impacted from almost total stripping through to damage where the vines were able to recover and harvest a near normal crop. They looked bad at the time, but recovered reasonably well. Our normal process here following these hailstorms has been to water and fertilise just according to the needs of the vines. If they do have a lot of the canopy removed by the hail, their nutritional and water requirements are low, so we're very careful about over-watering or over-fertilising at that particular stage. But we don't do anything special. We have used some biostimulants and other products, but generally even people who just water and use their normal fertigation programs appropriately to the canopy size achieve with these early hailstorms generally a full recovery of the canopy. And having a look at the canopies now, even the quite severely affected ones, they look almost normal now. As Chris mentioned, we had very good conditions for growth this year, very mild, quite moist through spring into early summer. So quite benign conditions and good for vegetative growth. So most of the vines now are looking quite normal, apart from the ones that were generally our north-south rows that were impacted laterally. So some of the ones that were impacted on one side do look a bit out of balance, didn't grow quite as much back on the impact side. And that's perhaps because of the fruit that was still present on the other side, the unimpacted or less impacted side, carrying lots and lots of fruit and carrying that through to ripeness, that probably led to this imbalance of growth. And that's one of the things that can cause some carryover issues into the next season, and affect some of the pruning decisions we may have to make. Generally, the Riverland is almost entirely, and it will be saying for most of the inland wine growing regions, that we machine prune. Most of the canopies are hedged. So the issues that Chris and Amanda discussed about having to select canes that can be wrapped down are not issues unless we're needing to wrap down canes or replace canes that were damaged on vines that were just being established. And we have seen some of the extreme damage that was shown in Chris's slides on those very young vineyards, and the same sort of decision making will apply to growers attempting to establish cordons for their ultimately spur pruned or hedged vineyards. So those comments that Chris and Amanda made regarding selection of canes, the best canes, whether you need to start again on re-establishing the cordons, are relevant to growers in that situation. But generally in the Riverland, our response, if we're attempting to achieve full cropping potential, normal canopy growth, is to recognise that some of the buds have been damaged, and we've got the same issues with hail impact on buds that can cause damage and death of those buds. The PBN certainly becomes even more apparent when we do bud dissections here after hail events. Same sort of things has been shown through Amanda's work. So our normal response, if we're trying to achieve a normal type of canopy, is just to prune a bit lighter, to simply leave an additional bud, to simply widen the pruning machine, increase the height to allow for that the loss of some of those buds that might be there. It can result in higher density canopies, but in our situation here, that ultimately doesn't affect the fruit development too much in the coming year. Can increase things like canopy density, can result in greater disease pressure inside those canopies. So we certainly follow up in the season following hail with pretty tight fungicide programs, particularly for powdery mildew in this area, and perhaps even looking at in some of our more rot-prone varieties, might look at applying botryticides or bunch rot control sprays where the vines have been badly damaged. But generally, with the early damage that we had before flowering, the crops did recover. Our assessments were that, and we assessed a lot of patches following the damage, and anything that we assessed as having 20% loss of potential ultimately showed little loss of crop relative to the long-term average for those patches. So 20 to 25% loss of potential, bunches being lost, was made up for by the compensation of the remaining bunches. And as I said, we had a very benign season this year. So the vines and the fruit had the ability to recover and ripen that crop that was remaining, and we could see quite large berry size responses that provided that compensation. So as far as this year, just in a summary, generally we'll be just pruning. We're trying to achieve normal crop levels, just reduce or lighten the pruning slightly. We've seen that some people have started already, and definitely seem to have allowed for an extra bud or so at pruning time this year. So, and there won't be any need to apply any different fertiliser program this year. The recovery was good this year, plenty of time for carbohydrate restoration at the end of the season. Our season was quite long. And just as a note about what was taken in by the wineries, generally, virtually all patches, surprisingly, all patches were harvested, even down to very 4 or 5 tonnes per hectare crops. The growers decided to bring that into the winery. Unfortunately, we had very few issues with mog as they came into the winery. Most of the harvester contractors were pretty good with the growers who did suffer quite bad damage and maybe only charged for diesel for harvesting. The growers were pretty keen to get the fruit off those vines, and I'd have to say that the wineries in this area were good in taking those hail-affected patches early, so that they did have more time to recover and restore themselves after the crop removal. So they would be my main comments about the damage we had this year and what's happened subsequent to that damage.
Wonderful. What a great summary. Thank you, Ian. So it's very clear that the favourable conditions have helped with the recovery in the riverland at least, and growers have just had to match their irrigation and fertiliser to the individual blocks needs as per usual. The comment that you made about widening and lifting the mechanical pruners to retain more buds, but making sure that growers are vigilant with pest and disease management programs for next season is a really good point. And then all of the points that Chris and Mandy made about selecting canes with as little damage as possible is key for those young vines that you're establishing a court on. Wonderful, thank you. Now I'll invite Chris and Mandy to rejoin us. We've got a few questions from growers. So just firstly, while Chris and Mandy are rejoining, we've had a comment from Mark Sosnowski, who has done all the research into trunk diseases in vineyards. You will probably know him well. He said, in respect to the risk of grape trunk disease infection, we'll be evaluating hail-damaged canes from Barossa Valley vineyards in the upcoming months. So watch this space. Thank you, Mark. A question from Matt Triffett. Do the laterals produce lower quality fruit when the main cane is damaged during a hailstorm and the lateral essentially takes over the primary shoot?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, but I guess, yeah, key is to obtain some fruit, but I'm thinking I wouldn't have thought it would affect quality too much, given that if the bunches are evenly spaced along the cane, and if the fruitfulness is saying that we're sort of looking at the 2 bunches per shoot, I guess it's something, yeah, we'll have to see how it all ends up.
Okay, thank you. Ian, any comments to add to that?
No, I can't see why there would be any issues unless the bunches were smaller and the berry size was bigger. I can't see why the quality would be any different at all.
Yep, great, thank you. Matt has also asked if you would suggest a dynamic pruning strategy, so using different pruning styles based on the damage of that particular vine, so spur pruning some vines and cane pruning others. He's suggesting that adjusting the water rate for the spray program to cover both scenarios would reduce the risk of pest and disease issues with that variability in pruning. Chris, Mandy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, absolutely. You're going to have to treat each vine as an individual with the extent of hail damage. I've seen a few vineyards myself where, you know, we're going to get the contractors, you know, to maybe, you know, some vines might be able to carry 2 or 3 spurs, and yet the vine right next to it, we might have to rod prune, say, back to, you know, 6 to 8 buds. So absolutely, whatever you've got, you're going to have to treat, in some cases, each vine as individual by adopting differing pruning strategies and differing pruning methods.
And probably the thing I'd add there is it depends a lot on what your target of your vineyard. If you're chasing a high-end wine quality, for example, I think you are going to be faced with more variability of, you know, bunch distribution, shading, possibly even might flow through to different levels of maturity and composition. So if you're really chasing high end, I think, to my point earlier, it may be best then to use shoot thinning as well. I guess to use a good quote from Lodo growers is, you know, in those scenarios, shoot thinning is pruning but finishing the job. And I know that's a bit scary with cost, but if that's got flow-on effects to not only making better wine, faster pruning in 23, setting your structure up, then you'll get your money back. But it certainly needs to be applicable to the economics in your situation. It's not, you know, something likely you're going to do in a high yielding sort of inland region. So
yeah.
And even consider reducing your cane length as well, so then the vine doesn't have to work too hard, and then perhaps maybe foster some additional growth for next year for restructuring your vines for pruning in 2024.
Yeah, and I guess to the question about the sprays, well, I guess it's a different space, different kind of concept we're talking about here with regards to spray coverage. It's a whole topic in itself. Water, you know, more water volume can help, but it's not a simple linear thing. I think with the fungicide conversation, I know this goes back a while to at the time of the event where people were concerned about, you know, botrytis, inoculum build-up. Coverage is, and we should never underestimate how hard that is. If you cannot get good coverage of that damage at that time, you're arguably wasting your money. So that's about far more than just water volume. So.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question about, is it in severely affected hail damaged blocks, is it better to prune with your secondary growth? So.
Yeah, I guess I'll take that question in possible 2 ways. One would be whether that was referencing going back and re-pruning immediately after the damage. That there's many different scenarios there. In some situations, as Mandy's shown, absolutely. You know, in other situations, economically, no. Insofar as if you're referring to the use of secondary growth, meaning laterals, I guess we've covered that pretty well, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the other scenario would be if the basil shoot has fired, you know, is that, and that hasn't had any damage. I think you covered that essentially, that you're really trying to retain canes with as little damage as possible, because they're the ones that are going to have the most fruitful, be the most fruitful. Is that an adequate summary?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the point around, you know, you're also thinking about setting up the structure or remediating the structural damage that's been done.
Okay.
Basil drops out a bunch per shoot anyway. The basil.
Okay.
Especially, and I'll just add there, I think, for example, with varieties like Grenache, we know they're quite fruitful on basil and low bud positions. So, you know, I think with a variety like that, you can probably more confidently prune them back quite hard, fix structure if that's required, or get away from damaged buds and still produce good crop levels.
Okay, so variety is key with that decision making. So a question that I think you've all covered in Mandy and Chris. So are biostimulants like sea salt and maybe organic matter added to the soil part of a post-hail recovery plan? So essentially, it sounds like in both regions, just sticking to your normal plan will probably be adequate in most scenarios. But Chris, you did mention places like Canberra where damage was experienced later in the season and there has been severe loss of leaf later in the season and the vines haven't had that chance to recover. A remedial plan that is a bit more intensive may be needed, but it would be a block by block scenario. You wouldn't be able to give a generalized recommendation. Is that adequate?
Yeah, and obviously people need to be, you know, remind themselves of the growth habit of grapevines. You know, there's not a huge nutrient and water uptake very early in the season. Pouring on lots of nitrogen at bud burst, for example, is generally a bad idea. Better off putting on small doses later when the vine is going to utilise that. And if it really comes down to the inherent capacity of the site, the soil. If the soil health has been a bit depleted for various reasons in the past, it's going to be more critical to improve that, whether that be, you know, mulch and so forth, maybe even fulvic acid through drippers. You know, talk to your agronomists about those things that will give you the best bang for buck.
Yeah,
Okay.
and we saw the patches that were slowest to recover were patches that where the soil health has been compromised over time or has reduced over time. They were slower to recover after the damage that they sustained. The healthy patches came back very quickly with minimal sort of change to practice. You know, the main thing to be careful of is that the nutrient water demands reduced, you know, almost in proportion to the amount of leaf that's been lost. So the tendencies is to kill them with kindness and overdo things. So if we looked at most of even the most badly damaged vines now, you know, they had a lot of time to come back. And you know, they're fully lignified now. We've got severe damage, pock marks and pitting and damaged buds, but you know, they're big canopies, recovered a big canopy and almost normal size.
So I guess the key take home from that, Ian, is and it's a message we're trying to get across really, is that building resilience in your vineyard is not something that you need to do only in situations like severe drought or hail damage, but it's a long-term strategy that growers need to be considering every year.
Yes. Well, there's a big focus.
And over time.
A big focus here on improving soil health, and the whole point of that is to give the vine that additional resilience to cope with droughts, with reduced water water that we may be able to apply in the future to tolerate these sort of shocks and recover from any sort of shock.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so we've got a question about, so from Murray, reworking in progress, new canes laid last year, quite heavy hail damage, thinking of spurring. Are the buds that did not shoot last season likely to shoot? Should I include these in the bud count or ignore? Perhaps Mandy, you might be able to provide some thoughts on that.
Just reading the question here.
Yeah, just read.
So I guess what there's
just a thought, maybe we could get Murray just to maybe get a little razor blade and then maybe slice a couple of buds, say bud 1 and bud 2 off the cane and see if there's any green. And if there's any green, that's an excellent sign. So yeah, I guess if they are green, I probably would include those into the bud count.
Okay, good. Yeah, great answer.
If they're fluffy, if the buds are fluffy, when you slice them and if you can't see any green, well, that's an indicator that, the bud health isn't so good. But if the buds are standing quite upright and when you do a quick slice and if you can see green, I reckon that's going to give you the green light.
Great answer.
Yeah, and sorry, just sort of you're reading more of the question there, I guess. If it's obviously one of those scenarios where that cane laid down after last year's reworking was badly damaged, I think for all the things I spoke about, think really carefully about whether you're going to run with that or prune it really hard and force new growth and almost start the process again. I think there's a hell of a lot of latent buds in older vines hidden everywhere. And if the health of the vineyard is good as Tim's talked about, I think they'll push like crazy next year.
So I guess the message was that even if that bud does push, the fruitfulness is probably going to be compromised. Yeah? No? Yeah. Okay. So there's another question. What about the initiation in secondary shoots? So bud initiation in secondary shoots.
Certainly very promising in varieties such as Shiraz. I looked at Pinot Noir the other day. Majority of the varieties that I've done dissections on, you usually get one inflorescence primordia per shoot in the secondary. I'm not quite sure how Fiano would react or some of the more modern alternative varietals, but I saw some nice secondaries in Cabernet Sauvignon as well. So I guess if you want to sort of seek further information on some of the alternative varieties, or if you're not sure, I'd certainly recommend a bud dissection from your local provider or give you some of those answers.
Yeah, great, thank you. A question for all of you, is applying a fungicide post-hail mandatory?
This is always a contentious one. I'll put my neck out and say no, in the sense that depends if you're talking, I guess certainly as far as botrytis or other rots of that kind. Obviously, people have a lot of concern when you've got green shoots that could be an infection site. Insofar as the Barossa, I certainly know some people that did, and I certainly know plenty that didn't. But we've got to remember that was early in the season, a relatively dry climate, and most part of the Barossa climate, Mediterranean style climate, it's pretty dry from December onwards. So the reality is with botrytis particularly, yes, it may at the time increase inoculum, but if you don't have the condition later in the season, it always comes to nothing in those scenarios. In a wetter climate, in the East Coast, very different scenario. So it is homogenised, but to say that it's mandatory in all cases, no. And it's expensive. And coverage. If you don't get coverage of all of those wounds, I question are you getting bang for buck? So.
Okay, so it really depends on your situation and the climate of your region. So in the East Coast, we know they had a lot of rain last season, so it would have been really important to get those fungicides on and try and get as good coverage as possible. Same with down in Tassie. And Ian, your thoughts, would you be putting on a botrytis? I mean, you'd be putting on powdery mildew and downy mildew sprays regularly anyway, but botryticides, would you go in post hail with that sort of product? No. Yeah.
No. Crucial to keep on applying the usual sprays for powdery mildew. Absolutely crucial, because it can. Because we had very benign conditions this year, that it was very favourable for powdery mildew. So it was very crucial that people, and unfortunately a few people didn't do that and ended up with a fair bit of powdery mildew later on. But most people just maintained their normal sort of spray programs for powdery, and we're still a bit worried about downy mildew through that time following those rains. But no, the usual botrytis sprays for the fruit, if they were going to be put on for some of the rot-prone varieties like Sauvignon Blanc or Semillon, yes, people did invariably put it on, but at the flowering stage, or just post-flowering stages as they would normally, or probably more inclined after the damage to apply that.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, can I just chime in if I can, Robin? In the Barossa, we did also have a very small isolated hailstorm. I mean, small area in northern Barossa in 28th of Feb. That was a very different scenario. What happened there, we looked at a couple of vineyards where you saw direct physical damage to the fruit. But what I'd probably add to that is, yes, that was obviously immediately introduced the botrytis risk, bunch rot risk. People invariably go in, we're pretty limited with products that close to harvest. But what I saw in that situation, which is exactly what I expected, the greatest risk in that scenario, especially in a dry climate, was not so much rot, it was secondary fermentation and volatile acidity and those other things that can occur when you get damaged fruit. So it's not discounting the importance of botrytis in those situations, but unfortunately what I saw in that, seen that before, is it creates problems that are really almost impossible to fix, which is scary when you're that close to harvest. So we can't just assume that everything in a 20-litre drum is going to solve these problems.
Yeah. Okay. Now, just to finish off, I did want to explore the concept of compensation for low fruitfulness a little bit more. So obviously, if growers know that they're going to have lower fruitfulness, they're going to want to try to retain more buds to try and get a better yield. So Chris, you mentioned that in high vigor sites, laying down more canes, more buds, whether it's longer canes or longer spurs, may be okay, and it will probably help to bring the vines back to balance. But in lower vigor sites, you could actually create an issue where there's poor shoot growth, and it will make it more difficult for pruning the following season. So my question for you is that if growers are looking at retaining more buds, and the vigor of their site can support that, what would be the best way to do that? So would it be leaving longer spurs? Would it be retaining more spurs of the same length, or would it be retaining another cane or a longer cane? I think you sort of touched on this a little bit, Mandy, but I just would like your thoughts on the best strategy there, given that every block is very different, obviously, but as a general rule.
I saw a grower the other day who's based in the Eden Valley region, and he had this dilemma. So we did an exercise where we did dissections on hail damaged canes versus dissections on brand new laterals coming off bud 2, 3 and 4 from the hail damaged cane, and also he had some awesome water shoots. So based on the results from that, he's going to, for each individual vine, in some cases he's going to use the lateral cane, and where he doesn't have a lateral, he's actually going to wrap down a nice fruitful water shoot to retain high numbers, because the water shoots come out quite fruitful as well. So it's just another option.
Yeah, difficult answer, obviously, but I think we probably all appreciate too, there's not this beautiful linear relationship between bud number and yield outcome, obviously, but for me it still comes down to, just imagine for a moment you had no hail damage, what would you like your pruning structure to look like? And I still think pruning structure, for at least the premium regions, spur pruning is really what you want to get back to. And the faster you can do that, the better. So, but fully appreciate you've got economic challenges as well. You don't want to suddenly have a fractional crop in 23 just to get that structure right. And in high vigor, you probably won't. The vines will go crazy, and then you'll have shoots everywhere. So, yeah, I suppose a comment earlier, think about the variety. How would that vineyard normally behave if you did that? Certainly, I'd be very, very cautious doing that. Putting on 4 bud spurs on a Grenache vine, I think it'll crop its brains out, put it bluntly, and you'll get weak growth. Shiraz is such a vigorous, resilient variety. You probably get away with a fair few things. I'd be very cautious, laying piles of buds with something like Riesling. They are, potentially quite fruitful, not necessarily very vigorous. You can end up with, not just high crop load, but high fruit exposure. If your canopy formation is not good. So, I hesitate to sort of give generous advice other than to think about what do you want that vine to look like come 23 pruning. What are your goals, really?
And if the vines are out of balance and you've got not much fruit but a lot of shoot growth, the risk is that you're going to get this really shaded, dense canopy, which is going to cause pest and disease issues, but also low fruitfulness for the following season. So you talked about shoot thinning, but things like splitting a canopy, can I even bring that up for growers in the Barossa?
No, it's a very good point, and as I think we've alluded to, it depends on the growing season at the moment. It's not be too predictive, but we're looking at very good winter and good growth conditions going into the next spring growing season. So at this stage, the precursors are pretty good nutritionally, climatically. There's obviously other factors in the background with market conditions that people obviously need to consider as well. But it's, I guess don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I can reflect on quickly a couple of experiences. One after some frosts in 06, 07 and going into 08, hail and Meiji back in the late 80s. There was often this assumption, the next year's going to be terrible. Quite the contrary. We saw very good growth, good crop levels. That's not to discount PBN, but we've got to remember that PBN issues are generally more a problem with high vigour, high nitrogen, high rainfall. So, the climate is obviously a big factor as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And Ian, you mentioned vines' ability to compensate. So if they've got less bunches, they have this ability to pump up their berries, which will have impacts on quality, but yield may not be as affected as much as we thought. Yeah, wonderful. Any other concluding thoughts, comments from anyone? Any more questions from listeners? No. No. I'd like to thank you all very much. It's such a pleasure to work in an industry where people are so willing to share their thoughts and experience and really help other growers that are experiencing similar things. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time today and all of the work that you put into preparing for this webinar. It's much, much appreciated. As we mentioned, we will have another webinar on hail in August. and we'll get some growers to talk about their experiences of how they managed hail straight after the hail event and what impact that has had on their vines. We also have our webinar program for next financial year kicking off in July, and I believe Marcel will give us an update on agrochemicals. And as I mentioned, this has been recorded, so all participants will receive a link to the recording. And thank you to Wine Australia as well for funding. Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Robin.
Thanks.